and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you. My name is Victor Kipiani. I'm the chairman at PLC-based think tank Geocase. Welcome to this webinar discussions, which will be focused on several aspects of the Russia-Ukraine war. On its second anniversary, I'm emphasizing several aspects because this war have produced multiple aspects or factors to be discussed, and definitely we won't be able to focus on each of them, but we'll try to highlight or touch on upon several of them which we thought to be critical for the purposes of discussions. Special privilege to welcome our guests and speakers and friends of us, Dr. Robert Hamilton at Eurasian Studies in the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. Dr. Hamilton, thank you so much indeed for your time to be with us today.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you to you and Geocase for the invitation.
Thank you. And I also have a special privilege to welcome a good friend of mine and who is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Society of Military Comptrollers, Mr. Richard Brady. Hello, Richard, and thank you also for your time for all your efforts in facilitating and setting up these discussions. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Victor. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you and Geocase for all that you're doing. Absolutely.
It's our pleasure to be together this time, although the reason for all of us getting together it's not very bright, but still, this is the reality, and a very important reality which we have to address and discuss necessarily. As I've said at the beginning of my in the opening speech, we would focus on different aspects. One is about the military aspects of the war. The second, which we deem to be the must to be discussed, it's about the diplomacy efforts, any sort of sufficiency in those efforts, or as we say, stopping the war, if that's possible at all at this juncture, at this point. We would also touch on the Western strategy to the war in Ukraine, and we would discuss, probably not in very details, but still we will try to do our best to discuss the post-war security options for Ukraine. But when I'm saying we're discussing security options for Ukraine, implicitly or explicitly, those discussions will touch on Georgia's security options as well. Not inventing a bicycle, I would say at the very beginning that this winter may be very crucial from a military standpoint and from the political standpoint. We've just witnessed, unfortunately, Ukrainian troops pulling out from Divka, and there are various connotations, gentlemen, of the situation on the ground. Stalemate or the war of attrition or the simmering war, but what looks like that still there are some dynamics. Perhaps Ukrainians were more or less successful on the sea. Russians are relatively successful on the land, and we have to look into the eyes of the reality that that's the case. Fortunately, Vladimir Putin has managed, my view, has managed to turn this war into the mode of the war of attrition. And these circumstances, I'm afraid that the time is not on the Ukrainian side. And that's also a strong message to the Western partners. We were witnessing, of course, and we have to admit that the European Union is conscious of the fact that Russia is trying to play a long game, and therefore it puts special responsibility on their shoulders, on the European shoulders, to sort of step up their defense industrial production and be prepared, for long commitments. We're also witnessing President Biden fighting or struggling for getting the congressional approval for the next package of the aid to Ukraine. And alongside, as any protracted war typically produces some internal frictions in Ukrainian domestic politics, we see clear features of criticizing Zelensky and his government, which was not the case at the beginning of the war, which probably results of unsuccessful counteroffensive. Also, various speculations about the sort of corruption, etc., etc. Obviously, we won't be able to dig into the details without having a plausible grounds. But nevertheless, there's a myriad of issues which would ask for your insights, gentlemen. It's about resilience, sustainability of the Western resolve. It's about the expectations from the NATO summit. It's about probably the same issue of defense and the industrial base. It could be to some extent about Ukrainian reconstruction, but I realize that the very complex issue, which we won't be able to reflect on, it's up to you to discuss an impact of the U.S. presidential elections or any possible outcome of the war of Ukraine. I leave the choice to you diplomatically and then sort of, implicitly as well. So, the situation on the battleground. What is a success for Ukraine and Russia in this war? Because we saw that we witnessed, sort of, an evolution of the definition what a victory means and what a defeat means. And the recent statement by Ukrainian forces that they switched to strategic defense, it speaks for itself because there are obviously limitations on both sides. And those limitations, they make it impossible, obviously impossible for any strategic advances on either side. So that results in certain war fatigue, losses, stretched resources. The Middle East war came into the play. And are we at the point that we have to reassess the sort of the sobering realities and look at that war, from different angle, because it's a completely new type of interstate war after the Second World War, something which we have not seen before. And I appreciate there is no sort of ready recipe for addressing the complexity of the war. So this is sort of a brief outline when we speak about the military aspect of the battleground status. So Dr. Hamilton, with your permission, so your views, please. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Victor. So the question I think is the military situation and likely trajectory of the war militarily. As you mentioned, General Syrski, shortly after he was appointed as the Chief of Defense of Ukraine, announced that Ukraine had shifted over to an operational and strategic defense, which reflects not only it reflects just the facts of the situation. It reflects the fact that the Ukraine's counteroffensive over the summer and the fall didn't achieve the breakthrough that some people hope. I think in retrospect, that was not surprising. What I think we're seeing is that offensive maneuver against a prepared defense covered by persistent surveillance in the form of drones and long-range precision strike has been and will continue to be really difficult in this war on the ground. In other words, so the big Ukrainian successes of summer and fall 2022 were enabled by Russian positions that had not switched over to a prepared defense, were enabled by some deception on the part of the Ukrainians that caused the Russians to thin their forces in the north around Kharkiv out. And then the first strike from Ukraine came there, and then the strike in the south also had some success later. But those were against Russian defensive positions that were not prepared, that were not dug in, that were not covered by 3 to 12 miles deep minefields and obstacles. The Russians at that point had not learned to use drones for surveillance as effectively, and they didn't have the number of them that they have now and had during the beginning of the Ukrainian counteroffensive last year. So I think we're going to see on the ground that for the time being, the defensive is going to be the superior form of warfare. At some point, a combination of technology and tactics will probably break that stalemate. We don't know what it is yet. but there's not a technological silver bullet. There never has been in warfare, right? It's never one thing that breaks a defensive stalemate. It's an innovation in technology used in a novel way tactically that can break a stalemate and cause the offensive to become a more dominant or viable form of warfare on the ground. I'm glad you mentioned the air and sea domains, because I think what we're seeing there is Ukraine is actually having a lot of success without conventional being overmatched conventionally in both the air and sea domains, but having, I would call, asymmetric or unconventional means to challenge Russia. I think at last count, the Ukrainians had sunk 21 capital ships, or 21 ships overall, in the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is somewhere around a quarter or more of the ships that the Black Sea Fleet had. They've driven the Russian Black Sea Fleet out of the Western Black Sea. They've driven it to Novorossiysk. They've driven it, parts of it, all the way as far as Ochamchira in Abkhazia, Georgia, right? So without a navy, Ukraine has essentially denied Russia control of the sea, opened an export corridor from Odessa and other Black Sea ports, and allowed the resumption of grain and other shipments after Russia pulled out of the grain deal. Over the weekend, we saw, I think, 6 Russian Su-34s and Su-35 shot down by the Ukrainians. So the air and maritime domains matter. They matter a good bit. And so this war probably will be decided on the ground. But the fact that Ukraine is able to hold its own in the air and at sea without a conventional air force that can challenge Russia's, and without really a naval presence at all, is significant. And if you study warfare, these are things we should be watching.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Thank you. That's very insightful. Rich, your point.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Victor. Again, thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. And it's really a pleasure to be on this panel with Bob to talk about the geostrategic implications of the war here at the second anniversary. And just at the opening, I would like to say that my, obviously, thoughts and prayers continue to go out for those who are affected by this war. It's interesting, though, as we look back, the current conflict really goes back almost 10 years to the day. It was around February 20th, 2014, when Russia began the annexation of Crimea. So, we talk about we're at the 2-year anniversary. We're also at a 10-year anniversary if we look at this from a little bit broader perspective. And I remember that time very well. As you recall, Victor, I was in Georgia at the time as a military attaché working in the U.S. Embassy. And I had a lot of questions at that time from fellow attachés, many of them in Eastern Europe, the Black Sea region, and even in Central Asia, asking what was going on, what was the West's response to this, how were we going to address the situation, and obviously having many discussions with my Georgian counterparts as well. They could clearly see those other attachés from Eastern Europe, the Black Sea region, and the Georgian counterparts could very clearly see a Russian pattern developing here. And I don't know that it was entirely clear to the West at the time. So broadly, I think this began with some strategic miscalculations and continues through what I would call some strategic ambivalence. And I don't want that to come across as sounding critical. Necessarily. There have been many positive actions by the West over the last 10 years, and certainly over the last 2 years, with the economic sanctions, military support, humanitarian response, NATO and EU enlargement, and diplomatic efforts on the back end. And as you rightly point out, the nature of this war is evolving. I think I said almost 2 years ago when this started that the West was playing for time and the Ukrainians were paying in blood. And that continues to this day to a certain extent as we've reached the point of a war of attrition. And I agree wholeheartedly with Bob's comment that there is going to be a breakout. We just don't know what that looks like at this time. And I think it's really unpredictable which side is going to break out. So what it really calls for, again, as you said, Victor, is resilience, sustainability, NATO resolve, and really alignment from a strategic perspective. So how we define success, which was kind of one of your opening questions, Victor, really, the ends, ways, and means of how we get there are not clear exactly. And, in some respects, this gets back to not only the nature of the war, but the nature of international relations, in that, for the better part of 20 or 30 years, we lived in somewhat of an idealist world, and Russia has now brought geopolitics back to Europe. And so I see a rise of the realists and people coming to grips, coming to terms with what that means, and the resolve, the resilience, the alignment that it takes to persevere and succeed in this type of environment, which I think we're going to be in for at least the next decade.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you. So, yeah, all in all, we all agree on that. Yes, the military aspects still remain critical enough, even in the context of political solution or addressing the conflict, addressing the war through the political context, and pointing out to the technological superiority or air defense or air superiority in terms of bringing the stalemate is very much critical for the parties to be compelled to sit at the table and hopefully, negotiating a peace treaty or a ceasefire at this point. And that takes us to another stage of our discussions, which is about diplomacy, which is about the diplomatic efforts. I already mentioned, probably there are not too many options to stop the bloodshed, because eventually the victims of this war is the toll of this war is very heavy. The civil population, the Ukrainian side especially, definitely. So, I mean, and that fatigue, I'm afraid, that fatigue, could take, to even more unwelcome consequences on the Ukrainian side. But definitely, any war should be stopped with dignity on fair terms and conditions. So, in that respect, while I was thinking about either ceasefire or peace treaty, of course, peace treaty is the most long-term commitment to stability and peace, but still, it has to address many thorny issues, and there's the differences between the parties are so dramatically wide apart. So I cannot think of durable negotiations at this point leading to the peace treaty. But whether the ceasefire could be an option, it's also a big question, because I don't remember exactly who said that, but the Second World War was the continuation of unfinished First World War. So if there is a shaky ceasefire without all the proper guarantees and mechanics ingrained, etc., that could be a good respite for resuming aggression, even with bigger force and more brutality. And that what makes me think, what is the more optimal, I'm not saying the best option, but the most optimal option. We also listened recently to Vladimir Putin's interview, famous interview to Tokyo, actually. Russian terms and conditions, even with the prospect of the ceasefire, remain the same: capitulation, surrendering the occupied territories, denazification, demilitarization. So the Russian stance has not changed, and that bothers me when I speak about the prospects or stopping the military actions. And also, I'm afraid that in that respect, Russia is very much heavily banking on absence of enough resolve by the West, as well as some domestic politics in some Western countries as well. So waiting out and looking for a better prospect, from Russian perspectives, for settling the war. I mean, that takes us, to those sovereign realities which I have mentioned. Although it also makes me to think loudly that alongside the war actions, diplomacy could still produce some effects. And I would remind all of us about the Korean War. Actually, when the talks have started, the ceasefire was reached after 2 years of those diplomatic shuttle so shuttle diplomacy. So many meetings or conversations or negotiations have been conducted between the conflicting, between the warring parties before they have reached approximately 40 pages of document, no more. So having an active diplomacy involved does not preclude being active on the battlefield, and to the opposite, being active on the battlefield does not sort of forbid and a diplomacy intervention if that's all possible and feasible and doable at all. So and also I realized that when we were talking to Ukraine about the diplomacy and resolving the war by diplomacy intervention, there should be some sort of measures to encourage Ukraine in terms of committing to investments, committing to reconstruction aids, committing to security options as well. And that's something, which we will touch on at the end of our conversation. So this is the whole myriad of interconnected issues. So it's not just the diplomacy, but it goes all with economy, alongside with economy. It goes along with the relative success, at least, in the battleground. But still, not to bypass the issue of the diplomacy, because there's some feeling in the world, that the parties are not investing, including the West, not investing sufficiently enough into the diplomatic efforts. Of course, I wish to sound on your opinions, and Rich, probably we would start with you and then proceed with Bob. Thank you.
No, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Victor. I'm increasingly of the opinion that the only solution here is a diplomatic solution. I think that we've passed the time really for a military resolution to the conflict. So as you rightly point out, what does that look like? I think if you look at historically or other analogies, it starts with some type of a ceasefire agreement, move into some lengthy negotiations, and then really it comes down to who has leverage, and depending on how long that negotiation period can last, leverage can change over time as resolve of the situation changes. I think it's important to look at this, from both perspectives, and I don't want to get into the fallacy or the challenge of mirror imaging when we look at Russia's interests in this. I think a lot of people try to look at this and say Russia is going to do this or they're not going to do that, but they're really looking at this situation from their own lens, from their own perspective. So it's very difficult. But as I see it, the Russian look on this situation is really this is a war for empire and wanting that strategic depth. So you may argue that does Russia have what they want already? You could look at it and say, well, they didn't achieve their initial military goals of taking Kyiv. Okay, so what? They still have occupied territories in eastern Ukraine that give them that buffer zone, that give them that destabilized area that they can use for leverage, just as they have and did with Nagorno-Karabakh, the situation in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, Transnistria, throughout this region. So has, in some respects, Russia achieved its aims and would be satisfied where they're at? I think that's a valid question to ask as the West moves into this and considers the negotiation period. And again, how the West defines success is also very important. If we define success as Ukraine has, which is restoration of their borders and territorial integrity and removal of all Russian forces, then I think that we're going to have to commit to a very lengthy process here and even escalate the military situation, which again I don't think is where the direction that this is heading. So again, how we define success with a diplomatic solution is just as important as how we would define it from a military standpoint as well. And again, Victor, you brought up the Korea model. I know there's a lot of discussions about that right now as well. Keep in mind that the Korea model has now been in place for over 70 years. So let's ask ourselves the question, are we prepared to continue this conflict, in its current state, or in a cold state for another 70 years, which requires significant commitment from an economic perspective, from a military perspective, and from a social and diplomatic perspective. I probably have more questions at this point, Victor, than I do answers or solutions. But again, I think the main point is the only solution I see at this point is a diplomatic solution, which is going to require some concessions, some negotiations for both sides.
No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, asking and raising the right questions, it's a big, it's also very much helpful, because I mentioned that there is no sort of recipe or right responses. We're facing a completely different type of the conflict, different type of the war. And sometimes raising the right questions, it's not just about having academic intelligence, but civic courage as well. So that's also very important. So we don't have to shy away from raising those questions by all means.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could just add one thing to that real quick, I think you're absolutely right. Anytime you do any type of strategic planning exercise, whether that's from a geopolitical perspective or even a business perspective, the further you look out, the greater the uncertainty is. And so, I think we need to look at this, given that this is really a long-term challenge problem, as a problem of deep uncertainty, and consider various scenarios and options, and the environment that we are trying to create over the next 5 to 6 years, because we really cannot predict precisely what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone 5 years or 10 years from now. So let's talk about the environment that we want to create at that point in time, and work toward that environment.
Sure, Rich, I very well hear what you say. Bob, your view on the the diplomacy sufficiency, or diplomatic resolve, or the appropriateness for diplomacy as well, I would put it this way, at this point.
Sure. So I guess I would say you can't really separate the military and diplomatic efforts. So first of all, I'll say this war will end in some sort of diplomatic agreement, like almost every war in the modern age has ended, right? Even we talk so much in the U.S. about our unconditional surrender policy in World War II. The unconditional surrenders of Japan and Germany were really not fully unconditional. Both of them still had capacity to resist militarily. Both of them were granted some conditions. For instance, the Japanese were allowed to keep the emperor. Initially, the U.S. position was the emperor had to go. So in modern warfare, total military victory, so achievement of all your maximalist war aims through military force alone, is exceptionally unlikely. And I don't see it as possible in this war for either side. Because even if the Russian army were to collapse and be driven out of Ukraine, this war is existential for Putin, and Russia has plenty of military capability to continue to bring the war to Ukraine, even if it does not have a single soldier on the ground, right? It's got ballistic missiles, it's got its air force, it's got its navy. Even though its navy's been pushed out of the Western Black Sea, it still has long-range strike capabilities, and it can continue the war. Even if Russia were to gain control of every inch of Ukrainian territory, I don't think Ukrainian resistance would collapse. I think you'd then see an insurgency that would go on for a really long time, be really bloody. So military victory is very unlikely for either side. But Thomas, here I think political science has something that's useful to add to the discussion. Thomas Schelling said war is a process of violent bargaining. So war is a process of negotiation. Fighting is negotiation, because it reveals information about the other side's capabilities and will. Right now, both sides in Ukraine believe they could get a better deal by fighting than by talking. At some point, probably, both sides will come to the conclusion that they could get a better deal by talking than fighting. I don't know how we get to that point exactly. I think we are in an attritional phase, and I think generation of manpower or personnel strength on both sides is going to be really important. and then also the maintenance of political will. The only way I can see this war, one side winning outright, is a political collapse of the other side.
Mhm.
I actually think that's more likely in Russia than it is in Ukraine. I don't think it's likely in either country, but I think a collapse. This war is existential for Putin. Putin knows it's not existential for Russia at all. It was a war of choice, a war of aggression for Russia. But for Putin at this point, I think he understands he cannot survive politically if he declares that Russia has lost the war. And he probably wouldn't survive physically if he declared that. And so he will continue to fight in some way as long as he's in power. If there is a political collapse in Russia, these authoritarian personalist regimes like Putin's are hard, but also brittle, right? At some point, they can take a lot of shock, but at some point when the cracks begin, they accelerate very quickly. And anybody who tells you they know where those cracks would come from and what form it would take, the collapse of Putin's regime, I think, is probably overly optimistic to the extent to which they understand things inside the Kremlin. But nevertheless, it's possible. And I think it's more possible than a collapse of some sort in Ukraine that causes Ukraine to withdraw from the war or to sue for peace. So I agree this war ends in negotiations. When they come, they'll come when both sides believe they can get more out of a better deal by talking and fighting. Then the problem becomes the commitment problem. Russia will probably not respect any ceasefire or any peace treaty that it signs. It will use it as an interlude to rebuild its military capability and continue the war. So then I think this is where we're probably headed in the discussion, Victor. So I'll end it here. But the question then is, how do you get Russia to respect any agreement it signs that stops the fighting?
Well, thank you for this very helpful point, Bob. Actually, we all agree that the peculiarity of the situation, that the geopolitical objectives of Russia, if any, and of course Russia has its own geopolitical objectives, and probably we will have some time to speak on those, are quite different, from the objectives of the regime survival. So a defeat, geopolitical defeat of Russia, could lead, to something else and more dramatic. And what that post-defeat Russia could be looking like, and the crisis which could erupt inside of Russia as a result of that defeat, I think that something, which has not been well thought. And I remember when the war has started, one of the objectives was one of the possible end games was, as I remember, disintegrating Russian Federation. So that's, I think, very realist objective, and I think, that's objective which has not been well thought. And nevertheless, it's still to expand on the Western approach, as we're speaking about the end game, the ceasefire, the peace treaty. Actually, we all are discussing, the possibilities, if any, of concluding this war as soon as possible, to avoid all the tragedy, continuing tragedy, which is unfolding before our eyes. So the Western approach, what is obvious. We won't object to, if you don't have an objection, that primarily sanctions have failed to produce the desired effects. We have to admit that. It is also that cliche or stereotype, or probably very well-grounded stereotype, of the fear of escalation by the West when they face, the Russian challenge, and that puts enormous strains on, let's say, the flexibility or the freedom of actions by the Western partners. But still, admitting those constraints on the Western politics, is it right to say that in these circumstances, and of course, we all realize that this war is existential for Ukraine, but of course it's not as existential for the West, but still the dire consequences which could happen as a result of the Russians' victory, Ukrainians' defeat, the humiliating blow to the prestige of the Western collective security order, and And also, it's a big encouragement or inciting, other visions or expansionist policies globally. So, I mean, it's not just about Ukraine, but it's a much bigger stake. So, realizing all those consequences, still, I think that we could say that still there is a gap in resolve on the Western side. And probably saying that these days Russia is more committed to the war than the West is. Perhaps it's in sort of exaggerating a bit, the situation, the reality, but it's not very far from the truth. It's my personal view. Of course, argue with me. But what looks like on the surface value, at least from my part of the world, that of course the West is helping Ukraine, but the West is helping Ukraine primarily to survive, but not to win. And between those two end games, or those two goals or objectives, it's a wide distance. It's a big distance. And I would also remind the audience, of course, with all the appreciation of the enormous help and commitment by the United States, but still, there's recently there've been some change in the tone of the president of the United States, where you all remember 1 year ago that President Biden has said that the United States is ready to help Ukraine as long as it takes. And then he recently rephrased his the construction of that commitment, and he said that they would be helping as long as they can. And again, that I'm not saying it's a huge time, but still, it makes a substantial difference. And is that just saying that understanding the complexities and understanding the lack of strategic certainty, and still, those how much the West policies is bound by strategic ambiguity, because they don't have those ready responses. So, and one more, when we speak about the Western approach and the possible end game, please correct me if wrong. You are military man, alongside with your academician expertise. The modern war is not about also territorial gains when we speak about concluding the new type of war, but it's also about getting political concessions. So what type of political concessions, if any, the West could get from Russia in terms of long-term security and stability? Because ending the military actions or fixing the frontier here or there, it's not the end of the story. So what happens next? What happens on the second day after concluding the war action, or the day after? So could we please, touch on those very delicate and very shaky points as well? Thank you. Bob, your insight, please, and then
okay.
Your side. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Victor. And now would be a good time for me to say that my opinions are my own and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position of the Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. In terms of Western support for Ukraine, and let me actually narrow this down to U.S. support for Ukraine. What we're seeing here, I think, is a failure of imagination, courage, and political will, and not necessarily something that American voters, the American people, are demanding in terms of reduction of U.S. or right now the suspension of U.S. assistance to Ukraine. There was a Pew Research survey that came out just a couple of days ago that showed 74% of Americans, including 69% of Republican voters, view the war in Ukraine as important to U.S. national interests. And 59% of Americans, including 56% of Republicans, say the war is personally important to them. Right. So this is not the Republican base demanding that we cut off funding for Ukraine in order to fund border security or fund Israel or do anything else. Solid majorities of Americans and solid majorities of Republican voters say the war is important to U.S. national interest and important to them personally. And so to have to make this case it is frustrating and sometimes exhausting. It's not a hard case to make. This is since the end of the Second World War, the United States has seen the prevention of the emergence of a hegemonic power in Eurasia as a vital U.S. national security interest because of the size, the population, the resources that Eurasia, sort of the continent of Europe and plus Russia, because of everything Eurasia possesses, prevention of a hegemonic power in Eurasia has been a core, a vital U.S. national security interest. Russia clearly has hegemonic designs. I don't know if it has the capability to achieve its objectives, but it clearly has hegemonic designs in the region. Ukraine fits into this. It's 44 million people. It's in the center of Europe. It's shown that it's not a military liability. It has fought the Russians to a standstill with significant Western assistance, but nevertheless, it's fought Russia to a standstill. It's making progress in democratization. It's making progress in anti-corruption as a war is happening. It's shown that it's critical to food security, especially to the global south. It's shown it's been a critical energy transport corridor for decades. The Black Sea, so as a region, the United States has finally awakened to the fact that the Black Sea is important to U.S. national security, and also it's the place where Russia intends to challenge the rules-based order, intends to challenge Euro-Atlantic security. All of Russia's use of military power in this century has taken place in the Black Sea or the Eastern Mediterranean, the only Syria being Eastern Med. Everything else that Russia has done militarily has been in the Black Sea. So it's clearly where Russia is mounting its challenge. And then finally, there's the legal or moral or ethical argument that aggression should not pay, that the rules-based order, or the liberal world order, whatever you want to call it, the idea that might does not make right, is worth defending in international politics. And so Russia presents an acute militarized threat to everything, all U.S. hardcore material, security, and economic interests, as well as a challenge to international law. It's committing war crimes. Recently, a scholar of genocide said what Russia is doing in Ukraine meets the definition of genocide from a scholarly and legal perspective. And then the final reason I think this war is critical to Western and U.S. national security interests is the message it sends for nuclear non-proliferation, right? If Ukraine is allowed to be subjugated to Russia, the incentive for every country is confronted with a neighbor who is a conventional military threat that it can't meet conventionally, the incentive is to go nuclear. It's to go nuclear. And Ukraine has said, several Ukrainian politicians have said recently, including at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend, they have implied that if Ukraine loses this war in the sense that it loses significant territory, loses Crimea forever, is forced to accept a peace, the only way Ukraine can defend itself is to break out of the non-proliferation treaty and go nuclear. That's a bad thing for global security. And we don't know if Ukraine would actually do that, but it would be a rational and logical thing to do, having given up nuclear weapons for security assurances that then were not respected, having lost a war to a conventionally superior neighbor who was also a nuclear power. The rational then conclusion is the only way to guarantee the security of what's left of Ukraine is for it to leave the non-proliferation treaty and go nuclear itself. I think that is for all those reasons, both supporting good outcomes for U.S. national security and preventing bad outcomes like that, continued Western support to Ukraine is critical.
I see, Paul. Thank you so much. Indeed, I completely agree with you on what you just said, and indeed, those issues should also be looked at very realistically, both from the Ukrainian standpoint and from the Western standpoint, and from the standpoint of the United States of America. You mentioned so well and so rightly about sort of preventing the rise of hegemonic interests of Russia. You also pointed out to the never-ending geopolitical factor of the Black Sea. So those points being extremely very helpful to be mentioned in the context of the second anniversary of the war in Ukraine. Rich, the floor is yours, please.
Great, thank you, Victor. I I would have to say the same thing. I agree wholeheartedly with everything Bob has said. I would just add that I am concerned that that message doesn't resonate with Middle America. That they're not seeing that full picture. And I, kind of started out by talking about being a realist. I am an unapologetic realist when it comes to this. And at the end of the day, I think that most nations are going to put national interests over collective interests. And in a situation like this, where, as I also mentioned at the beginning, when I was there talking to my counterparts from Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region, they were very close to the situation. They understood the urgency of the situation. But the further you moved out from that, as I talked to the Western European attachés and then even got into some of the Central South American areas and even the Americas, that message just didn't resonate. There was less skin in the game. So I'm afraid that, while Bob has made a very compelling argument, we have not made a very compelling argument to the average American. Unlike during the Cold War, where things were very clear, it was a bipolar world. We knew who the enemy was. Everybody was behind it. It's a lot less clear today, and there are a lot of other competing interests. As we move into, we're all the way into this election year now. Let's look at the other interests out there. There's obviously the Middle East, which is very polarizing as well. There's the tensions between China and the U.S. As it relates to Taiwan. There continues to be increasing inflationary pressures, economic pressures on the average voters that weigh on them. So I agree with the Pew Research poll that when asked, is Ukraine important, people are going to say yes. But I think that there's a further question that can be asked, and that when you put that in relation to other issues, where does Ukraine fall in relation to the Middle East crisis? Where does it fall in relation to China and the Taiwan issue? Where does it fall in relation to the economic pressures and increased taxes that people are feeling? So I think that largely this year is going to drive a lot of the election discussion, and why Ukraine isn't necessarily going to be at the top of the list. And I think, as Bob pointed out as well, where there's been a lot of discussion about the Ukraine aid package and its ties to immigration policy and border security and everything. But again, that's frankly missing the point. We're going to approve aid for Ukraine. The question gets back to the one you posed at the beginning, Victor, and what does success look like, or where is this leading? That's the compelling argument that needs to be made to the average American voter or Western European voter, I would say. I was about a year and a half ago, I was traveling in Central California, the Inland Valley region, where there's a lot of agriculture, and just talking to people out there. This was before our midterm election. And there was a lot of discussion at that time about the Ukraine aid package. And I was talking to people out there, getting their thoughts about it. And they had a hard time understanding it. They said, look at all the issues we've got right here, potholes in the road and infrastructure problems right here. Why are we sending all this money? We just have not made that compelling argument that, again, Bob very well articulated, and I agree with, but it's just not resonating right now with the average American, Joe Sixpack, who just got off a shift at the local factory, and he's wanting to know why his tax dollars are getting sent overseas. We can understand that, but we've got to be able to explain it to them and make that compelling argument.
But while speaking about the compelling arguments, Rich, and I was going to ask this question at the end of our conversation, but you prompted asking this question now about the compelling argument about the economic strengths on the Western economy, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, let us be a bit clear that when we speak about U.S. aid, it's not. It should not be understood as giving away money to Ukrainians. It's also about investing, in the U.S. economy. So the different data in that respect, that the whole sectors of economy, towns and cities, have revived, new employments being created, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, that is probably, shall we say, it's sort of, a lack of a proper educational campaign as well. So it's not just about the geopolitical objectives, but also about the rational law, yes, we mentioned so helpfully, the realistic approach. So the realistic approach is also about, I mean, unfortunately, if any war, any big scale war goes along with sort of, some investments into the economy, reviving, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in that respect, it reminded me about the recent article by the head of CIA, who said so well that 5% of the U.S. defense budget, the whole aid to Ukraine, and he even said that in a very open manner that it's relatively modest investments with significant geopolitical returns. That was sort of very candid statement by a very high-ranking official. So could we please explore a little bit on that point, Bob, Rich, on the sort of this. It's not just one way street, with of course, with appreciation of the morality and the solidarity with Ukrainians, etc. It's also another end of the street, that's about investing into production, into manufacturing on the US side as well. So let us touch on that subtle issue as well. Thank you.
Yeah, just briefly, I agree. I think that's the narrative that is being put forth right now, that, you look at the Ukraine aid package, the majority of that money is going to go to U.S. defense contractors. And so it is going to lead to jobs and some economic improvements in that area, in that sector. I'd say, and I agree with that, that's an important point to make. But, the backdrop of this also is, from a larger economic perspective, is the growing U.S. debt, which is now over 34 trillion. Interest service on that debt is going to next year exceed U.S. defense expenditures. It's going to approach $1 trillion a year. So it'll be the third largest part of the U.S. budget now, or spending, right after Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, will be interest on the U.S. debt. And so what happens when your debt rises to that level, which it is now, it begins to crowd out other areas of the economy and raises the rates of borrowing for everybody. It generally leads to lower economic growth. I think that's the backdrop of this as well. While increased U.S. aid may be a short-term boost to the defense contractors, the longer-term issue is still the ballooning U.S. debt that will be a central component to the election discussions this year. Unfortunately, I don't know if either of our political parties has the resolve to cut spending, but you either do it voluntarily or you're eventually going to be forced into the position. So I agree with you, Victor. I think that's an important point for us to be making to get the aid package approved for Ukraine. But I don't want it to obfuscate the point that we really still need a very clear strategy of what success looks like and what this is leading toward. That's the compelling argument that I think we need to make for people to understand the long-term investment that needs to be made here.
By all means, and thanks so much, for this very helpful clarification. Bob, your take on this issue?
Yeah, I agree with Rich on the sort of long-term impact of a $34 trillion debt, right? I mean, it's just something we used to talk about a lot, right? We had sequestration during the Obama administration. We actually had a balanced budget for a few years in the 90s. We had a surplus during the Clinton administration when you had a Republican Congress. The White House and Congress were able to work together. I think you're right, Rich. Neither party is feels fiscally constrained anymore. It used to be that one party was spent lower and one party spent more. That doesn't appear to be the case. So that's a problem. But in the immediate term, so 40 of the $60 billion that's in current Ukraine supplemental that's stuck in the House of Representatives, I read this yesterday, 40 of the $60 billion of that goes directly back into the U.S. economy in terms of contracts for U.S. defense contractors to produce things that either will be given to Ukraine or replenish U.S. stocks of things that have already been given to Ukraine. So that, 2/3 of that money goes straight back into the U.S. economy. In terms of, again, not to quibble with Director Burns of the CIA and his article and the 5% number, but I think the better indicator of impact is if you look at U.S. purely military aid to Ukraine as a proportion of the U.S. defense budget over that same period, February 22 to February 24. And these are Department of Defense numbers. $43 billion is the amount of aid we've given to Ukraine so far in the first 2 years of the war. And that actually goes back to a little bit before the war started, because we started using drawdown authority before the war started in late 2021. But the number is $43 billion. The U.S. defense budget over that over 2022 and 2023, it's not an exact comparison. We use fiscal years, not calendar years. Nevertheless, it's good enough. U.S. defense spending over that period is 1.56 trillion. So 43 billion of 1.56 trillion comes out to 2.7%. 2.7%. So the message I think needs to be for 2.7% of what we have spent on defense over the course of the war in Ukraine, Ukraine has destroyed, and this is, again, these are U.S. Department of Defense numbers, 315 of the 360,000 soldiers that Russia had at the beginning of the war, 2,200 of about 3,500 tanks that they had, and 4,400 of 13,600 armored personnel carriers. So that kind of damage to the biggest military threat to the U.S. and its allies for 2.7% of the U.S. defense budget over that period is absolutely more than we could ever have asked for. If you'd have told people pre-war, there's going to be a war, Russia's going to invade a neighbor, it's going to lose 315,000 of the 360,000 soldiers that it had in its active force on the eve of the war, and it's going to cost us 2.7% of our defense budget, anybody would take that deal. Hey, we didn't start this war. Ukraine didn't start this war. Russia started this war. But it's the only opportunity we have to damage or destroy the most acute militarized threat to U.S. national security interests at the moment. And if we fail to take advantage of this, Ukraine's doing all the fighting and all the dying. No Americans have died, right? No U.S. government Americans have died fighting in Ukraine and aren't likely to. So this is the biggest national security. If we fail to take advantage of this, it's the biggest national security own goal of my lifetime. It's the biggest instance of just malpractice, national security malpractice that I've seen in my adult lifetime. If we really fail to do what we know we need to do to destroy or damage Russia's military capability.
Yes, and I would just add about that. Well, since we mentioned William Spence, the article that he also reminded helpful to the U.S. audience and to the Western community that's for the United States and for the West, to walk away at this point, that would be an own goal of historic proportions. That's very important because still, it's a tactical fight. It's not just fight for Ukraine, but it's a fight for an international order in Europe and Eurasia. So I'm always saying that the war in Ukraine is not just the war in Ukraine and about Ukraine. It's also about Moldova. It's also about Georgia. It's about many of those states, which was for decades after the dissolution of the Soviet Union being sort of, put into the position of the geopolitical pendulum, if you will, that uncertainty on no man's land. Of course, no man's land again, they're always exaggerating because if not the Western commitment, if not the U.S. commitment, I cannot imagine Georgia to be as it is today. But the reality is now on the ground, they commit all of us, to sort of, to more focused approach, but that's a resourceful approach as well. The last point, again, with appreciation, it's not the very last one, speaking about the second anniversary of the war in Ukraine, because of the myriad of issues, like sort of, international crimes or the fate of the frozen assets and so forth and so on. But still, although we said many times that an understanding on the end game is quite vague and quite obscure. Nevertheless, let us endeavor. So, speaking briefly, we have exceeded 1 hour time, but still we could have 10-15 minutes to discuss the post-war security options for Ukraine. Again, there's sort of broad discussions about those security options, starting with Israeli model, but also there have been quite good discussions and sophisticated discussions, how the Israeli model differs, from the Ukrainian model. So I won't go into the details on that point. Individual security commitments or guarantees, and again, there's also, some very much unhelpful interplay of guarantee and commitment, because those two mean completely different, not just from legalist point of view, but from political point of view as well. And yes, and NATO membership and the forthcoming summit in Washington D.C. and expectations, realistic expectations or unrealistic expectations of starting the accession talks with Ukraine. So your insight, gentlemen, please. Who will start first? Rich, will you start?
Sure. No, thank you. If I heard the question right, again, kind of what's the end game? What does a post-war security situation look like? You brought up the concept of security guarantees. I think that is a part of this, but they are only as effective as your willingness to enforce them. So I think that we need to be realistic about that, realistic in our approach. And I think it really comes down to, in the end, with some type of a diplomatic solution, creating and maintaining leverage. And I would propose that including those security guarantees for Ukraine, we look at regional centers of power around Russia, in Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Black Sea region, Eastern Europe, as counterbalance to further Russian aggressions. And what that really translates into is increased support to our allies in those regions, Georgia notably, that as we look at support for Ukraine, we should be looking at bolstering the economic, political, social, and military aspects of our partners and allies in these regions.
Thank you, Rich. And Bob, before you proceed, may also add another sub question, or it's not even a sub question; it's a big question. When speaking about the post-war security options, there's also quite a broad discussions about the post-war Russia security consensus in that overall design. Is how legitimate it is, to discuss that post-war Russia security concerns, because how they stand today, of course, they're completely unacceptable. But if there is any way, for any accommodation, because frankly speaking, my point of view, without having a proper Russia and a normal Russia and a stable Russia, speaking about the finality of the order and stability, just the kidding ourselves and just in indulging ourselves into something which is non-realistic. So that would be sort of an extra point which I would reintroduce into those discussions as well.
Yeah, you're right. That's not a sub question. It's a big question. Yeah. So look, Georgians don't get this wrong. Georgians and Ukrainians, Moldovans, the Baltics, other countries on Russia's periphery understand this very well through hard, bitter experience. But here in the U.S., and I think certainly in Western Europe, we get things wrong about Russia habitually, and it causes us to implement bad policy toward Russia. I say all the time, there are four things we underestimate about Russia. We underestimate its definition of its minimal security requirements. So Russia's definition of minimally acceptable security requirements is so expansive, it's so high that it instantly, if we were to try to meet it, it would instantly undermine the security of all of Russia's neighbors, not only the security, but the foreign policy, agency, and independence of all of Russia's neighbors and every state along Russia's periphery. So we get that wrong. We believe that Russia has normal security requirements, that security requirements of a normal European state. It doesn't. The second thing we get wrong is Russia's perception of threat. One of my colleagues, Pete Zwack, he used to be the U.S. Defense Attaché in Moscow. He says all the time, Russia has real, perceived, and contrived threats. Russia has real threats like any country. In fact, it has more threats than most countries because it's big, it's broad, expansive. Population density in the east is fairly low. It lives in an unstable neighborhood, but then it has perceived threats. It has threats that Russians actually see as a threat that we look at and say, we can't imagine why you would understand that as a threat. NATO enlargement is one of those things. NATO does not threaten Russia, and large NATO does not threaten Russia, but Russia perceives a threat from NATO. Those two things can be true. Both things can be true. And then there are contrived threats, right? The Kremlin makes things up all the time and accuses us of doing them and claims that these things threaten them when it knows that we're not doing these things, right? So where that makes it hard for us is to disentangle perceived from contrived threats. If we label something contrived that's actually a perceived threat, then we do things that feed Russian threat perceptions. The third thing we get wrong, I think, a lot is Russia's tolerance for risk. It's much, much higher than ours is. And it's higher than ours is because it perceives itself to be in the weaker position vis-a-vis the West, because it is. And the way you make up that difference in power is by being more acceptant of risk and doing things that you know your adversary is not willing to do. And then the final thing that we get wrong all the time is Russia, the cynicism and suspicion with which Russia looks at other states, especially Western states. And when we appeal to things like the UN, international law, ethics, norms, the law of war, there's a real cynicism about that in Moscow, and they believe that we don't believe in any of that stuff either. And the only reason we deploy these arguments is to make Russia look bad. They believe that we are as cynical as they are, we just hide it better. So those four things always will make policy toward Russia difficult for Western governments. And frankly, I don't know if we can meet in a post-war environment Russia's minimal security requirements. I mean, the Kremlin has already caused, by things it has done, by responding to things that aren't threats to it, it has already caused NATO to deploy battle groups in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, and now 4 Black Sea countries, right? Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Hungary. It has caused a war in Ukraine. It has caused the formation of a strongly unified, radically anti-Russian, pro-Western Ukrainian nation, something that did not exist 20 years ago. All of these things undermine Russia's security. All of these things are artifacts or outcomes of things Russia has done. So in terms of post-war security guarantees for Ukraine, I don't think we should overcomplicate this. I think we will, but I don't think we should. As soon as there's a ceasefire in place, we should declare all territory administered by Kyiv, whatever that is, in Ukraine, under the protection of NATO, subject to Article 5. Ukraine should have an accelerated process of NATO membership that does not involve MAP, because MAP is just an invitation for Russia to meddle. And Ukraine should be admitted into NATO as soon as possible. And it's whatever territory Kyiv controls should be subject to Article 5 immediately. There's risk in that. I understand that, but we continue to approach these major national security issues as if they should be risk-free. They're not. I think there's greater risk in allowing Ukraine to become some sort of undefined gray zone, buffer zone between Russia and the West.
Yes.
Over and above the fact that that's an unjust outcome for 44 million Ukrainian people who fought really hard to preserve their independence.
I fully agree. I fully agree. It's not just about the Ukrainian sovereignty. It's about the prestige and the reputation of the Western community as well, and the Western political community, security order. Indeed, thinking about ideal solutions in these realities, it's out of the question. So whatever we have, and some of the territories which is controlled by Kiev, should be given a proper recognition. Let's put it this way, and by giving a proper recognition, by giving a proper political status and giving a proper security status, would be the best rebuke to Russia's aggression. Because as we say, having a prosperous and democratic Ukraine, that's essentially something, which the Kremlin is afraid of, that's sort of, from their standpoint, a malign influence or penetration in terms of undermining the domestic regime, because having that example next to them, the two nations, same legacy, same difficulties, still one being much more successful, Then the another one. What could be the West, not nightmare for the Kremlin in these circumstances? So this is quite obvious. And the second point, when speaking about the security order, etc., still we have, at least what I'm saying when I'm asked about the better, the most solid conditions, for the Russian neighborhood in terms of security is for getting Russia normal. That would be the best precondition, for the safety, security, and prosperity along the Russian borders. How that could be achieved, of course, that's a big subject, which we won't be able to discuss at this point. I'm conscious that we have exceeded, the timing for our conversation. So, if there is anything you would like to add, Bob, Rich, before we conclude the session, thank you.
Let me just add my thanks to you, Victor, again, and to Geocase for bringing us together today, and for all that you're doing, to improve, and advance institution building within Georgia and the Black Sea region.
Thank you, Rich. So much appreciated. Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for everything you and Geocase are doing to build civil society and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic future. We didn't get to talk too much about Georgia today, but I know Rich and I, for both of us, it's a country very near and dear to our hearts. We spent a lot of time there, I want to see Georgia succeed. I passionately hope for Georgia's success, for its Euro-Atlantic integration, and stable liberal democratization, economic growth, all those things. I want that very badly for Georgia, and anything I could do to contribute to that, I want to do.
Thank you so much indeed for your kind words. Thank you so much indeed for your sort of, the kind words about Georgia. You are the dearest friends of this country. You're the dearest supporters of this country. So thank you so much indeed. You've did a lot of great work in the past, and I very much hope that you will have many opportunities to invest not into the well-being of Georgia, but into sort of, in the progressing or advancing our bilateral relations as well. As with Ukraine, always all we could say, even though we said that it's uncertainty, etc., we wish for Ukraine for international law to prevail. And when we say international law, it speaks for itself. It speaks for sovereignty. It speaks for territorial integrity, inviolability of its borders. So we wish for Ukraine to prevail in all possible respect, to the largest extent available under the international law. So thank you so much indeed, Dr. Hamilton, Mr. Brady. Thank you so much indeed. It was my pleasure. And I look forward to future opportunities to interact with you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.